What do you think is the one thing that most investors still misunderstand about sports and sports media?
I always go back to the storytelling. If you have a great story and great storytellers, you'll be fine. I think something that might be misunderstood is that.
Meet Patrick Dimon, president of Front Office Sports Studios and former senior creative producer at HBO Sports, a sports media veteran who has built some of the most compelling all-access, behind-the-scenes content in the industry.
YouTube is killing it. Mr. Beast shoot, penalty kicks with Ronaldo, and it's incredible. Like, obviously, it's different from what I do, but I sit there with my son, and I'm like, this is amazing. Like, it's fun, it's light, but there's no denying that their numbers and their followers are huge. For me, it's tough to tell on social and things like that how much is real engaged eyeballs.
Do you think that independent creators could become as influential and as relevant as traditional broadcasters were in certain part of sports?
This is my take, and I hope it's true, is that
I'm delighted to be joined today by Pat Dimon from Front Office Sports. Pat has played a key role in the growth and evolution of one of the most influential platforms covering the world of sports media today. Obviously, very, very strong development over the last few years, but you've been at the forefront of the evolution of this sector. It'd be great, perhaps, to start with, to get a little bit of your background and how you got into the Front Office Sports story.
Yeah, so I've been, luckily, knock on wood, kind of in the sports media space for 22 or 23 years. I interned, going way back, I'll give you the abridged version, but I interned for NBC Sports with under the kind of Dick Ebersol, John Miller group. And then I ran a local television station in Aspen, Colorado called Plum TV, which was a little bit more lifestyle, food, real estate with also some sport. And then came back to New York, and I was with HBO for, I think, 8 or 9 years, which was incredible. Obviously such a incredibly talented team. They were at the forefront early, all Hard Knocks and 24/7 were kind of the first off the field all access shows. So they were really groundbreaking, and the team was incredible there. So I was there for about 8 or 9 years. And then when I left HBO, I show ran and directed Full Swing for Netflix for the first 3 seasons, which was, obviously, again, incredible, kind of groundbreaking series. And that brings us up to Front Office Sports. So yeah, that was kind of my evolution about 2 years ago. Jeff Zucker and Adam White came together and we launched Front Office Sports. Adam obviously has Front Office Sports, and then we launched Front Office Sports Studios shortly thereafter.
I guess, when you start building your career in the world of sports was still a relatively niche part of the content world, at least, in terms of, let's say, studio positioning. Of course, live rights have been, at the forefront of media consumption for a while, but in terms of actual, let's say, scripted content or, shorter content, let me say it without, being too, restrictive about the positioning of it. But what do you think it's the side of sports that better, aligns to be represented into, your studio's business?
Obviously, Front Office Sports has we're multi. It started off initially as a subscription, like a letter that went out twice a day, massive amounts of followers. Adam started it in his dorm room at University of Miami 10 years ago, and it had a huge fan base immediately right away because they were focusing on, not just recap, box score recaps, but it was really the business and the culture of sports. So it was everything kind of off the court, not the X's and O's and the box score. So, there's a huge fan base for, obviously people love to watch live sport, but then people love to know what's going on outside of the, 48 minutes or 4 quarters or 3 periods. So, that is where the studio side comes in. And so I came up in the all access kind of off the field, off the court world. And we still focus mainly in that space. So the kind of access-based series. And, I still believe that is in my opinion, of course, I'm a little biased because that's why I got into this, because I loved seeing these all, the all access, seeing the athletes off the court. But that's still really where we, features and series is still where we maintain a lot of our focus on the studio side. And we do a lot of branded content with athletes. Obviously that's we'll talk about that, but that's an emerging, it's been around, but it's an emerging trend of where brands are coming in and doing a lot of storytelling, which is great. But yeah, that's kind of where we sit on the studio side.
I mean, it seems to me that today fans are spending a lot more time trying to understand not just, let's say, the sporting performance, but also, the dynamics behind those sporting performance, which sometimes it means, ownership structures, the value of media rights, of course, involving private equity, valuations, a little bit like if they're following financial markets. What do you think has driven that shift? I mean, is it something that has been contributed on by platforms like yours, or is it just, the world we live in with, so much access to every information?
I think it's a combination. I mean, listen, it was only naturally going to, as sports, as people are watching so much, live sports, it's only natural for the fan to be curious about, especially when you're sitting there and you have so much access in your fingertips to, while you're watching a game, being like, oh my God, this right winger is incredible. And you immediately can look up, where they're from, who's their club they played with before. You have so much access at your fingertips. So I think it was only the natural, people are curious, just, not just sports fans, human beings are curious. So it's only natural that sports fans are going to be curious about, not just where, one of their favorite players on their favorite team, where they're from, when at the high school, where they came up in the minor leagues, so it's only kind of, in my opinion, the natural progression that people want all the information, and that, sometimes fortunately or unfortunately, delves all the way into the finances of how these leagues and how these teams and how these players and everything, how it all operates. And to be honest, it's fascinating. I mean, the business world, which, I always maintain that I'm a creative. I don't pretend to understand the kind of business of it all, but you can't deny that it's a fascinating world. I mean, people love to know how companies outside of sports operate. And so it's only natural, I think, that sport fans want to know how these leagues and how these teams and how private equity and how it all comes together off the field. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying, I think it was the natural progression that people were going to dive into this. And again, like you said, it's with so much access to information that, listen, and some of the information maybe isn't so accurate, and then you start, rumors start, swirling. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much information out there and people are curious, so they're getting into it.
One of the themes I think about a lot is that sports organizations today are not just competing effectively against each other, right? They compete against, and to be fair, I mean, I think I've heard one of your shareholders, Jerry Cardinal, talk about this, a few conferences, right? Your competition is not just, your other basketball team or your other football team or whatever. It's also the entertainment you can get from Netflix, YouTube, TikTok, you name it.
Yeah.
Do you think, though, that, all sports executives really appreciates are competitive, that the dynamics of, the the economics, I guess, of the entertainment world are?
If anybody understands it, it's Jerry and the, and the executives that are much smarter than I. But yeah, I mean, I think the oversaturation or the saturation of content, and that is, like you said, social, short form, medium form, long form, fun fluff versus really kind of deep diving, investigative kind of journalism, the dark side of sports. I mean, there's just so much out there. And if you have I don't know if you have a finite amount of viewers, but yes, I mean, there's no doubt that, there's never been as much content as there is now, but obviously as we go forward, it's only going to get more and more and more. So yes, I think obviously everybody knows that you're kind of fighting for eyeballs and attention. And I hope this is my take, and I hope it's true, is that I think viewers and attention has just and will continue to become really efficient and savvy, where people if they want to spend 10 or 15 minutes and they just want something light and easy, they can scroll kind of TikTok and Instagram. And if they want to dive a little bit more into something that's really well put together, you know what I mean, produced and not written if it's unscripted, but something that's really thoughtfully curated and put together, which so many places are doing phenomenally, then that viewer will also, if they have an hour to spend that night, will dive into the more docs and the features. So I think the fight for kind of eyeballs is there, but I also think the viewers have gotten really savvy on, okay, if I have 5 or 10 minutes on the train, I can scroll through social. And if I really am a fan of this team or this player, and I know that this doc or this series is coming out, they'll definitely go and kind of dig in deeper for more long form, is what I hope.
And if you have to think, which organizations are, in your view, doing the best job in terms of, understanding the modern media consumption? I mean, do you have some examples you like to point to?
To be honest, I think every place, and I think places are figuring it out. And again, I'm no expert on how to try to predict the future of what's going to work, but I think every kind of platform does a really great job at what they set out to do. Does that mean that, Netflix is obviously getting into the live sports? Listen, that is a natural progression, I would say, for them because of, the interest in the fan base and the viewership numbers is there. And I think that was only a natural progression for Netflix. And I think they do a great job at it. But then listen, you have X or, Twitter X getting into kind of longer form content, not just kind of user base, but there's really, there's high end content going on Twitter, which is also incredible. So, and then I think the HBOs and the Amazons of the world and kind of the streamers are right where they need to be. Some places pride themselves on, I think, quality more than quantity. And then some places are maybe kind of more in between. And then some places really are like, we got to push content. And they do that really well. So I think, in my opinion, every platform, streamer, social, whatever, and any vertical knows what they're going for, and they do a really great job at it. And then again, you have your content creators, YouTube is killing it. And that is, I have kids and they're watching, Mr. Beast shoot, penalty kicks with Ronaldo. And it's incredible. Like, obviously it's different from what I do, but I sit there with my son and I'm like, this is amazing. Like, it's fun, it's light, and it's exactly what, an 8 to 12-year-old would watch. They're not going to dive into a full hour doc on Ronaldo. When they get a little bit older, of course they will. So I think everything fits a need for every platform knows what, hole they're trying to fill. And I think they all do a really great job at it, in my opinion.
Do you think that independent creators could become as, influential and as relevant as traditional broadcasters were in certain part of sports?
If you would ask me that probably, 5 or 10 years ago, my answer would have obviously been different. But I think there's no denying that the content creators, from pure numbers and subscription numbers and views, I think there's no denying that Mr. Beast or Jake Paul or, listen, I'm not a huge social media kind of YouTube creator guy, just because, to be quite honest, I just don't have a lot of time for it. But there's no denying that these athletes, and even if they're not athletes, like obviously Mr. Beast is a great example, but these former athletes and ambassadors of sport, I mean, yeah, their numbers and their followers are huge. Now, listen, are those numbers as real as, Nielsen ratings from like an NFL game when you have the Steelers play the Pats, and those are real hard numbers and those are massive numbers? I tend to think that those numbers are a little bit more real and those are real engaged eyeballs. For me, it's tough to tell on kind of social and things like that how much are real engaged eyeballs, in my opinion. But the demand is clearly there and the viewership's there. So I think there's no way to, you can't say that individual creators are not kind of knocking at the door of the same kind of eyeballs as traditional outlets.
Look, I mean, I think that's definitely the case, and kind of connects us into the explosion in sports storytelling that we have seen. And, I when I used to run in a family office, we also had an investment in a production business called New Studio. So, we did our own, documentary, including Take Us Home on Leeds United and many others. And so, we this, huge boom in sports documentary, and maybe the most famous of them is Drive to Survive, and probably everybody mentions it, and rightly so, as something that really changed the fortunes, I guess, of Formula One, right?
Absolutely.
Do you think we are, reaching a little bit of a saturation point? There is a little bit of fatigue on this sports documentary, trend?
You hear it, I hear it. Even if you're not if you're in your friend circle, I'm sure everybody hears it. Everyone's like, well, what are you watching? And everyone's like, oh my God. Someone brings up some show and you're like, I had no idea that was even on. I'm watching this and I can barely have enough time to get through it. So yeah, listen, there is so much out there. And again, I think it was the natural progression of what we talked about earlier. The technology, the access to cameras and microphones and iPhones, to capture content. I mean, there was no stopping it. There's more content and media out there than ever. So yes, I think there is a saturation, oversaturation, but I think we're in kind of a course correct, because I think you'll talk to a lot of people, like you said, if you run a production company. I'm talking a little bit more now about, series and docs, like bigger budget, not just and I'm not knocking it, but like iPhone out there and you just are running around on TikTok and Instagram, that can go on forever and that'll get tons of views. But I'm talking a little bit more about the curated content. I think we are in a little bit of a course correct where people are finding that buyers, platforms are probably a little bit more judicious about what's working for them and what's not, so maybe X amount of projects were getting greenlit 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And everyone was like, Drive to Survive is doing great. There's no reason that show can't work with kind of unknown leagues like, or lesser known leagues like cricket. Listen, cricket's huge in, obviously you're in Europe, in India. It's an emerging sport here in the States, but who's to say that a cricket Drive to Survive is going to work? It might not work. And is a platform going to take a gamble on that? They might not, They have to decide whether, is that, kind of cost worth the risk, So I think there was definitely a saturation point. Listen, I don't pretend to know the business side as well as other people, but I think we have hit that oversaturation point. And I think platforms are smart and being more efficient with what they kind of greenlight and what they're taking their risk on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It feels though that audiences are also getting used to learning to know more, as we were saying before, and in a sense, it's interesting to see how, going back to Drive to Survive, it has been able to basically find a whole new level of audiences, right, that probably before did not exist. So do you think that at the end of the day, audiences are also happy to go and look for this type of content, going forward? Or do you think, let's in a sense, if you are a league, you need, or an IP owner, you're better off focusing into the real life content?
So you're asking live versus kind of the doc space. I'm hoping, and in my opinion, that there's room for both. I think that the live obviously, gives the view, the live is what it is. You have to play the game. Everybody watches because you want to see how your team does. But in my opinion, I love the doc space, and I hope there's room for both, because I think that, we'll take, like you brought Drive to Survive. Before it started, everyone said, oh, it's never going to work in the States. It's global, but it's not in the US. And then, no one's ever going to get the chance to know what it feels like to sit in an F1 car and go 250 miles an hour. So everyone's like, there's such a gap there. Like, everyone can go hit golf balls. Everyone play basketball, soccer, football, so they can relate to those sports. Everyone said, oh, F1, no one is ever going to be able to sit in an F1 car and know what that feels like. So there's not going to be any interest. Clearly, a testament to, Paul and Box to Box and Drive to Survive is that they made the show and the characters so compelling that you didn't have to know what it felt like in an F1 car. You were getting that feeling through the storytelling and the characters. So In my opinion, I hope that the leagues, and listen, whoever it is, we mentioned earlier, brands, it's not necessarily on the leagues or the teams, brands are heavily involved in these leagues. And I hope that there is interest and continued interest and in space for the doc kind of feature and series going forward. And I think people will continue to look for that content if they love the live side.
Okay. And in terms of your own, focus as a front office sports studios, what type of, content you actually focus on and on what platforms?
So front office sports studios were, multi-platform, multimedia. So branded short form, YouTube series, awesome YouTube Stadium Eats is a really big platform for us on YouTube, a really big channel for us on YouTube. But then again, and we also are all the way across live events as well, which is a really interesting space. And then, YouTube, we're massive on LinkedIn. So we kind of utilize all the platforms. And then obviously for our more longer form, those are for, the HBOs, Amazon, Netflix of the world. So we're multi-platform, multimedia, long form, all the way through short.
Okay. Well, let's switch gear a little bit. One of the let's say hot topic also in content production these days is AI, right? And that's probably one of the biggest conversations across the industry. So, for a start, how is AI impacting your business today, and what do you think is the biggest impact that it can have?
I am probably old school and a little slow to the AI space. I mean, we utilize it for some back end where it's needed. So kind of scripting and temp track like voiceover. And obviously it's incredible for that. I'm a little concerned about AI in that if it starts to listen, there's no stopping it. Like we said earlier, I think same with content creation. Everyone 15, 20 years ago, no one would have thought that you could shoot a doc show on an iPhone and a wireless clip-on mic. Those didn't exist 15, 20 years ago. And now it's the norm. So my concern is that a lot of our content is created by talented professionals, and whether that's, verite kind of lifestyle out there filming from recreation, obviously archive is what it is. But if you kind of take away that field and recreation and studio, and it starts going through AI, my concern is that what happens to the workforce, like writers, for example. Obviously, there's unbelievably talented writers out there. What happens when production companies, everyone starts using, ChatGPT, any whatever AI platform, like what happens to the writers, so that's why I am kind of slow to utilize it. I'm a firm believer in working with great people and whatever their talents may be. And I just get concerned that if that becomes automated, I don't know what happens to the industry. And, people can say, well, that's just kind of evolution and you have to pivot where needed. But if you're automating all the production, then I don't know where it all goes. It becomes smaller amounts of people needed. And listen, the quality, I can't speak to that. The quality could be incredible from AI, but that still means that a writer or an editor or a director of photography doesn't have a job. So I get very nervous on that front, but there's no stopping it. So I don't have the answer to that, but it keeps me up at night.
Do you think it makes actually increases the value of trusted brands in a sense, right? Because otherwise, today, anybody could start, a newsletter or something and publish twice a day, right? The question, however, is how do you build that trust? And so, in a sense, does the fact that now it's so easy for anybody to do that, does it actually gives even more value to the value of brands?
100%, yes, agree with that. And again, I'll go back to I just get nervous that I think that the automation hasn't gotten up to the quality level of real writing. Like I'll just use your example for the like FOS is twice a day newsletter. Could that be automated? Like you said, like could be a 2-man company and they just they use ChatGPT and they send out 2 newsletters a day. That could totally happen. My hope is that the writing and the reporting from real human beings is obviously trusted and vetted, and the quality is better than the automation. Again, is that going to be the case in 5 days, 5 months, 5 years? I don't know, but I hope that, to your point, that a trusted brand only becomes more valuable because that it's real.
And obviously, all of this is happening at the same time as we are seeing so much investment from institutional capital into the world of sports. As we were discussing before, of course, you've also been a beneficiary of it. But, whether it's private equity, sovereign wealth funds with, some recent downs, but generally, still there. Of course, family offices. So there is so much capital flowing into sports, right? I think that's under everybody's eyes. But if I were to ask you, what do you think is the one thing that most investors still misunderstand about sports and sports media?
I always go back to the storytelling. So I think if you have great story and great storytellers, you'll be fine. I think something that might be misunderstood is that, and listen, I'm guilty of this as well, is that something that I think might be a great story might not resonate at all with the public. And so, not everything's going to be a hit and not everything is going to be a winner. And so to come in and throw a bunch of capital around, it might not hit. And then I've been on the end of this as well. Is that something you think might work? Is just of no interest, and it's only interesting to you and a handful of other people. So
I think a little bit, sometimes, obviously, you cannot make everybody equal, right? So of course there are exceptions, right? But I still feel sometimes, when you have institutional investors that come maybe from other industries with a lot of expertise, they kind of miss a little bit the cultural aspect of sports. Maybe I'm thinking more about, the IP heavy businesses, whether it's a team, whether it's a league, they miss the fact that ultimately, these are businesses that perhaps in some cases have been going for hundreds of years. They're obviously built on passion. They're obviously, sometimes supported by people that don't necessarily do that job because they're going to get rich. They do that job because that's their life. That's what they want to do. And it doesn't matter whether they get paid, $5 an hour or $500 an hour. And I think, sometimes, instead some people come in with, different, of course, using data, analytics, comparisons, and they don't realize that at the end of the day, you cannot just take what has worked into an industrial business and to apply into a football club. So I know that's one thing that I think, sometimes is missed by institutional capital.
Sure, we could obviously name a number of kind of areas where that's happened. And listen, I don't blame either side. The capital side, they come in, they try to increase the brand, and that's their job. On the fan side, they were a fan when it was a home team and it was funded by ticket sales, and I don't even know what else. But you can't blame either side. I would love for there to be a happy medium, and clearly it works in some places, and clearly it doesn't work in other places. But I think that if you can find that right fit with the capital, with the IP, with the team, I hope everybody's a winner. But clearly there have been some kind of missteps in that area, but it'll correct itself. Like we're obviously seeing, like the English Premier League is probably one of the better examples where, I'm sure better than I, but an injection of capital sometimes isn't always going to make the team better, make the fans happy, and make it a better experience for everyone. And then, that's, you have to just try it and see. But there's definitely going to be some failures there.
And I think you're right. I mean, it's not about blaming anybody. It's just, coming with a different approach, and what approach may or may not work, and, what can create, let's say, more issues than they're trying to solve, in a sense. Going back a little bit into your experience with front office sports, do you think that, platforms like front office sports are being valued more as a platform, or they are being valued more as, content organization?
In the case of front office sports, in my opinion, it's a brand, it's a platform, because we're across so much. Like I said, Johnny and Adam and the team, it's live, it's branded, it's cross social, but we also do long form. So in our particular situation, we're a platform, we're a place to get not just, box scores and recaps, but, to get the, the culture and the business and everything, everything kind of off the field. People know that they can get trustworthy reporting and more of the, like I said, the business, the culture, the food, what's all happening around your favorite leagues and teams. So I believe that in our particular situation, it's a platform and not just a content creator.
And if you were to deploy capital today in sports or sports media, what would be your best bet? Would it be women's sports, creative economy, more infrastructure? What would you think about data businesses?
Yeah, it's hard to choose because everything's kind of exploded. Obviously, women's sports is incredible and long overdue for getting the spotlight. Obviously, like you brought up, data. I think there's no arguing that data has completely changed sport. I hope and I think, again, for the best. Listen, I know some people are, again, we talk about automation. Are we going to lose umpires in Major League Baseball? And is it going to be an automated strike zone? Is that good? Who am I to say? But I think for sure, as far as, listen, if you're a fan that thrives on, I just want to know that it's exactly right and there's no room for, subjective kind of like tennis, for example, the line calling, like there's no arguing that a line judge can't call a millimeter of a ball going, 100, whatever, 10 miles an hour. Clearly matches were had different outcomes before before the technology that could tell you a serve was out by a millimeter. So if you're the type of fan that's just like, I want to know exactly what's in, what's out, no room for, subjective calls, it's great. But it's also super cool where, like in golf, you can know, flight path and ball speed and swing pace and everything. So it just brings so much more, science of the game to everyone. So I think, going back to your question, I can't really name one area because I think they're all, like we brought up earlier, they're all fulfilling a spectrum of fan. Everyone is filling a gap of that in that spectrum across the board. And I'm all for it. Everything that kind of brings every angle of the game kind of to light, I am a fan of, and I try and learn as much as I can about each of them. So I think I couldn't put down, listen, content creation, data, women's sports, analytics, it's all, in my opinion, it's all great. Where I will say though, is that it's tough because if there's so many, like you brought up earlier, capital coming into these leagues, if you have multiple leagues in the same sport, how do they kind of coexist? I think that's very tough. And where do you find that happy medium of, well, why isn't there a baseball or football team in every city? Like they could raise the funds for it and sure, would it work? But then, where are we with, is that too much? You know what I mean? But of course you want to expand and that's natural. So where do you find that happy medium in all of it?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think you're totally right on highlighting these issues. And look, I mean, to close off, I guess, there is so much happening, so many changes, so many things that could be impacting our industry. And I'm wondering, if we were to sit down 5 years from now, what do you think has changed the most? And what do you think, would be, commenting on?
5 years from now, I think you'll see a lot more fan, athlete, league, team kind of engagement, which I think is good. There's not going to be such a barrier, between the teams and the sports and the athletes and the fan, which I think opens everybody's eyes up to, understanding both sides and making it a happy, like a better experience for everyone. I think that line will get kind of blurred or I think there's just going to be a lot more fan engagement, which is exciting. I think the linear versus streaming and the live rights will be extremely interesting. I don't know where that goes as far as, the barrier to entry is so high for live rights. So, I don't know where that is in 5 years. But again, I think some places are looking outside of the kind of core for, our traditional sports. And like, for example, volleyball, women's professional volleyball now is a really, in my opinion, is such an amazing sport to watch and athletic and fast. And so I think there's a few upstart leagues there that are really doing well. So thinking, 5 years from now, thinking outside the box of just traditional sport, the core ones that everyone knows about. Like we brought up cricket earlier, and kind of expanding. Listen, the core sports are always going to be there. They're always going to be popular. There's a reason, because, they're endemic, that we all grew up with it. It's in our, it's innate and it's in our blood. But there's so many great games and sports and leagues and teams out there that I think 5 years from now, you're going to see a growth in that area. Yeah. Content creation. Like there's going to be so many incredible athletes and entertainers that blur that line between, sport and entertainment, which I find incredible. Like there's just so many great characters out there that walk that line, that can kind of explain sport through a different medium. So it's going to be really fun to see who emerges there. Yeah. I can barely keep up with what happens in 6 months. So 5 years is going to be excited about Olympics. And I think, I think the Olympics were a really big success. The past 2 or 3 Olympics have been a really big success. So I think everyone was a little concerned about the traditional games, but I think the World Cup's going to do great. And so I'm happy that the traditional kind of global events are doing really well. So that to me is something that I grew up on. So I'm happy that those are doing well, and hopefully continue to do so in the future.
Great. Pat, thank you so much for joining us. I think it's been a very interesting conversation, full of insights on the status of the industry. And for everybody listening, please make sure to check out, Front Office Sports and follow Pat's work. And as always, thank you for being and listening to the Berkida podcast, and look forward to staying in touch. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Massimo, for having me.